Welcome back. Now, student protests at universities in South Africa are nothing new, and neither are the clashes with law enforcement agencies. What is new, though, is yesterday's security footage showing what looks like a bit of an almost nonchalant way in which a bystander was murdered, allegedly by police. So what is also new is that the lack of funding for students is, depending on who you're quoting, between double to 4 times higher than ever before because of COVID-19. And of additional concern is that protests are expected across the country at more places of higher education over the unprecedented lack of funding for students. And joining us now to discuss this, as well as the events that unfolded yesterday, is Buthanani Thobela, who's the Secretary General of the South African Students' Congress, or SASCO. Buthanani, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Morning, Sakina, and thanks for having us.
Buthanani, let's start with yesterday's events. If we can just talk to the experiences of student protesters yesterday.
Well, what happened yesterday is very unfortunate, and it is actually something that we've been raising, of the poor policing that we face in the country, and the excessive force that is used on students, and the militarization of SABC. Of course, yesterday's events allows us to mobilize society against police brutality. I mean, you would remember that as from far back as 2015, our campuses have been having heavy police presence. But we also attribute this to the poor management skills by those who are heading institutions of higher learning.
Now, Buthanani, there are those who say that, students also tend to provoke law enforcement officials when students block traffic and they start smashing cars, refuse to heed the call by the police. That is also a form of provocation. Damage to property, some are saying, is a criminal offense, and that students agitate and they show their frustration in this way. How do you respond to that in terms of students actually agitating the law enforcement officers and infringing on the rights of other South Africans?
Well, one, we can say that SASCO has always been consistent in its call against any vandalism of property. But I mean, on the question of provocation, I don't find it to be quite an honest assessment. I mean, when you protest, you are bound to, for instance, if you take it to the streets, you are bound to close that street. And students are very compliant. For instance, if they are asked to occupy one lane, there is no event where they would refuse. But the manner in which the police do their work is actually the provocating manner. For instance, we went to picket outside Parliament. There was no disturbance of anyone's rights, but you had police still pushing and shooting at the students. I mean, their first response to anything that they see is shooting rubber bullets, particularly at students. So it would not be entirely true that students provoke them. I mean, it's the only form when students retaliate. And the only retaliation, for instance, yesterday, you had students being shot at whilst they don't even have stones, they don't have anything, they are lifting their hands up, but police don't even bother to engage, they're just shooting.
And that's the footage we're looking at on the screen right now. And, I actually have chills watching the man who ultimately passed away yesterday during that particular incident. 35-year-old man who was an innocent bystander standing near a car who was then shot. What did students who were there in that particular instance, at that particular scene, what have they relayed to you?
Well, it's traumatic. I mean, to see somebody in that state and passing on in front of you, it has its own psychological effects on the students. And it's quite sad that the police still continued to shoot. And I mean, it's trauma. And it's And actually, this is what the police do. You find that they impose these shootings and tear gassing, and nobody speaks of the long-term implications of those incidents that happen.
And also the question of leadership. And, you know, we talk about the lack of leadership from the national level and those within the sector. But when it comes to students themselves, you know, we spoke a little while ago about the standoff between students and police, and how we haven't seemingly learned anything over these years of the Fees Must Fall protests, because we still continue to see these run-ins, we still continue to see the injuries, and now we have a death that has occurred. And yesterday, the Sowetan newspaper reported, or rather they're reporting that there was a scuffle between members of the EFF Student Command and SASCO over what has now become the politicization of that incident where someone was killed. Do you know about that? Can you tell us more about that scuffle?
Well, Sakina, what we can say is that we as SASCO have resolved to mobilize all progressive forces, particularly who have an interest in the higher education sector. So the incident, indeed, you see, another issue that we have is that you have few individuals who get overwhelmed by seeing that they are journalists. In the protest of yesterday, you had the leadership of the SRC at Wits, which convened everybody, and it was actually a protest led by the SRC. So at some point, we are aware that there were students in the EFF regalia who wanted to take over from the SRC. The SRC allowed all political formations who were there to speak to students. You had the national organizer of SASCO there speaking. You had the SG of EFF speaking. So really, some incidents are unfortunate, and but of course, as leadership, we do engage on issues of common interest, because what we ultimately want to see is a transformed higher education, is to see the clearance of historical debts and the elimination of financial exclusion and academic exclusions. That is our primary interest. So, which is why we then believe that we must engage everybody who organizes in the sector.
So that brings us to the crux of the matter, really, and why we are seeing all these scenes unfold. The funding issue for students at institutions of higher learning. So if you were to assess it as SASCO, what is the main issue right now?
Well, as SASCO, you would remember that we went to picket outside SONA, and our message was simple, that the president must end the austerity measures which the government is implementing. For instance, last year on the 14th of October, we had a march that spoke to the investment grant of infrastructure for TVET colleges, and ultimately turning TVET colleges into construction sites, so as to make TVET colleges institutions of choice. But the response by the Minister of Finance is to cut about 932 million for infrastructure grant. We speak of the NSFAS indicates that it needs 4 billion extra in order to be able to survive and handle the pressure. But instead, you then have the minister cutting about 6.8 billion. And to an embarrassing and shocking incident, that you have the minister announcing that there is no funding or plan for first years. How is it that as a country that is a developing country, we are supposed to move forward if we can't invest in education? To say the least, it is quite an insult, particularly to us as SASCO, that participate in the campaigns of the ANC, because our relationship and our contract is on the question of providing free quality education. Now, when you say you can't fund education, it is indeed an insult to us. part of the reasons why we took a decision to say we will not be campaigning for the ANC if it does not provide what we had agreed upon. And there is a pronouncement made by the same government in 2017 on the question of first years and first-time entering students not being given a bursary, so that you eliminate the financial stress. So we just can't accept the current austerity measures that the government is using. We understand that COVID is a serious issue, but we can't use COVID to cover up the corruption scandals which have actually led to this deficit that we find ourselves in.
So you have been in conversation with government around this issue, and quite frankly, it comes down to money, making the funds available. It's a simple issue in the end. So what is the outcome of those discussions? Will the money be made available? What has been told to you?
Well, we are hoping that the money will be made available, because if the money is not made available, we will render this higher education sector ungovernable, unfortunately, because there is no way that we will have students being left out only because they are poor and they can't afford. I mean, the sense to say that first years who are entering must be people who are able to pay the registration fee. I mean, we long past the question of registration fee in 2017, when the government committed that the students won't be subjected to the question of registration fee. So we don't even understand why we should be discussing the question of first years. What we should actually be dealing with now is the question of the historical debts and how do we clear them, and the question of how do we fund the so-called missing middle, which is largely dominated by public servants, which is why last year we made a submission to say the NSFAS threshold must be increased at least 600,000 per annum, so as to accommodate the public servants, because they are the ones who are dominating the so-called missing middle. And we can understand that the missing middle, the middle strata is already in debt.
But when you say you are going to render these institutions of higher learning ungovernable, at what point? And what exactly do you mean by that? Because you have now the issue of first-year students, and it's been stated quite categorically that there is no money. There is no money to actually fund them. Hence, the standoff in the first place, but also the question of historical debt. So in the absence of that funding arriving, what will you do? And what will you prioritize one set over another set of students in terms of, okay, if the historical debt can be cleared, those students carry on and it's all back to normal? Or are you going to hold out until all demands are actually met?
I mean, we have to hold out until our demands are met, particularly on the question of first years. What we will do, for instance, on the 31st of March this year, we have a march to the president again to remind him on the commitments made by the government to the people of South Africa, particularly around higher education. So we are in a process of mobilizing society. One will mobilize the labor movements, your COSATU, your SAFTU. We will mobilize any progressive civil society. And we are simply saying, for instance, you have institutions that are running online. We must find a way to compensate for that. There is a promise of laptops, which has not been delivered. So if you are saying there's no money, it actually leaves us worried that will those learning devices even arrive. You have institutions like TUT that have not even finished the academic year of 2020. So we can't, of course, prioritize one over the other. Government must be the one who reprioritizes its priorities, and cutting of social spending and on education is something we just cannot accept. Surely there are things that the government must actually cut and prioritize education.
So just a final question on all of this. Appearing before SCOPA this week, NSFAS actually indicated that they'd incurred 522 million rand in irregular expenditure. Were you able to unpack that to find out exactly where that money went and whether it was in fact justified irregular expenditure or not? And what's your comment on it overall?
Well, when we got the report, I mean, it is quite upset because you have NSFAS spending a lot of money on traveling and accommodation for its executives, and we just cannot accept that. If you remember very well, last year we did blow a whistle on the corruption which was happening at NSFAS. So we will continue, of course, scrutinizing NSFAS. The NSFAS, at least now, because it has a CEO and it has a board that we can hold accountable. So we will obviously have to meet the board to get to understand and also get to understand what is the business turnaround of NSFAS as an SOE in terms of managing its lifelong plan and intention.
Well, let's leave it there for the time being. Buthanani Thobela is the Secretary General of the South African Students' Congress, talking to us about what transpired yesterday outside Wits University and also a planned nationwide strike over lack of student funding for higher education. And as you heard him say there, they will render these institutions ungovernable unless their demands are met. Let's take a break. We'll take you to news and we'll speak to NSFAS after 7.